The night sky above Earth was filled with burning streaks of light, each one representing the remnants of a spaceship crashing into the atmosphere. Among them, a lone pod tumbled through the air, its trajectory wild and unpredictable. Princess Alara's escape pod, once a symbol of the technologically advanced Centauri Empire, was now a fragile capsule, barely holding together as it fought against the crushing forces of re-entry. Inside, Alara lay unconscious, unaware of the chaos unfolding around her. Moments earlier, she had been the beloved heir to the throne, respected throughout the galaxy, until a sudden coup had shattered everything. Her uncle, the Emperor, driven by greed and hunger for power, had turned against her. She had barely escaped the palace with her life. Now, stranded on an unfamiliar world, she had no idea what awaited her. The pod's malfunction had only made matters worse. As the pod tore through the sky, Alara could only hope it would land somewhere safe, or at least somewhere she could survive long enough to make a plan. But survival was not going to be easy. The pod crash-landed in the remote, rugged mountains of Earth. Alara's head slammed against the hard walls of her seat as the pod hit the ground with an ear-splitting crash. For a moment, everything went dark. When her eyes finally fluttered open, she found herself lying in the remains of the wreckage, bruised, disoriented, and unable to remember how long she had been unconscious. The world around her was strange, nothing like her homeworld. The air felt heavier, the ground beneath her feet harder, and the sky above looked impossibly blue. She tried to stand but stumbled, her legs weak from the crash. As she steadied herself, the hum of distant engines reached her ears, and her eyes scanned the area. She was not alone. The first thing she noticed were the drones, alien machines, sleek and deadly, searching the wreckage. They had followed her here. Despite the primitive nature of the world she had landed on, these drones were highly advanced, far more sophisticated than anything humanity could produce. Alara realized with growing dread that she had no way of outrunning them. The Centauri Empire had technology far beyond anything Earth could imagine. But out here, in this primitive land, she was nothing more than an alien with nowhere to hide. As she tried to assess her situation, a sudden rustling in the distance made her freeze. From behind a cluster of boulders, a human emerged. At first, Alara's heart skipped a beat. She had heard of humans. Rumors, stories from travelers who had crossed paths with Earth's inhabitants. To her, humans had always been nothing more than a curiosity, a primitive species, inferior to the advanced civilizations of the galaxy. Her empire had always looked down on Earth, but as the human drew closer, she realized this was no mere curiosity. This was a person who might be her only hope. The human was tall, broad-shouldered, with a rugged, weathered look. His clothes were simple, made of rough fabric, nothing like the sophisticated armor or garments Alara was used to seeing. His eyes were hard, focused, scanning the area with a calm intensity. He seemed to notice her immediately, and for a brief moment, their gazes locked. The man didn't hesitate. Without a word, he approached, his hands reaching for something at his side. Alara instinctively reached for her blaster, but the feeling of the weapon's weight in her hand reminded her of her vulnerability. She was not in her kingdom anymore. She was on Earth, surrounded by primitive life forms, with no way to defend herself. Just as the human reached her, a blast from one of the drones rang out, tearing through the air. The human immediately sprang into action, ducking and rolling to the side, narrowly avoiding the deadly energy beam. His eyes darted to the wreckage of her pod, then back to the drones. The man didn't look afraid, but rather determined. Alara couldn't help but watch in stunned silence as the human, this primitive human, did something she had never expected. Using nothing but basic tools and sheer resourcefulness, he began to fight back. He picked up rocks, large branches, and scrap metal from the wreckage, using them as makeshift weapons. Each time one of the drones fired, he responded with quick, instinctive movements that allowed him to avoid the blasts. A rock flew through the air and struck one of the drones, disabling its targeting system. Alara had seen many battles in her time, but this was different. The drones were highly advanced, and humans were supposed to be no match for such technology. Yet this human, Jack, as he introduced himself, was doing the impossible. With every passing second, Alara's perception of humans was shifting. This was no weak species. This was a species capable of fighting back. Jack didn't even seem to care about his own safety. His focus was entirely on getting her to safety. "Stay down," he barked as he grabbed her arm and pulled her toward a nearby rock formation. She was too stunned to protest. "Why are you helping me?" Alara asked, her voice still thick with disbelief. She had barely recovered from the crash, but her mind was already racing. She had to find a way to get back to her empire, back to the Centauri fleet. But first, she had to survive this. "I don't know who you are, or why you're here," Jack said, his tone grim but determined. "But I'm not going to let those things get you." As Alara and Jack crouched behind the rocks, she caught her breath, her heart racing. Her mind spun as she tried to process what had just happened. She had landed on a primitive world, but this man had already shown her more than she ever expected from Earth. And then, another drone appeared, much larger and more dangerous than the others. It hovered above them, its weapons aimed straight at their hiding spot. There was no time to plan, no time to think. It was now or never. Jack acted immediately. He grabbed an old piece of metal from the wreckage and fashioned it into a crude but effective shield. With the drone's laser targeting them, he used the shield to block the incoming blasts. Alara, still in shock, watched as Jack quickly devised a plan. He led her to a narrow path between two steep cliffs, using the terrain to his advantage. The drone followed them, but it was slow to maneuver through the narrow space. Alara could hardly believe what was happening. She had always assumed that Earth, with its backward technology, was nothing more than a dead-end world. Yet here, in front of her, a single human was showing the resourcefulness and courage of an entire species. And now she was beginning to realize something that shook her to her core. This human, this so-called primitive human, might just be the only one who could save her from the dangers she now faced. The drone closed in, and Alara knew there was only one thing left to do. She would have to trust Jack. But could she really rely on a human to protect her from her own empire? As the drone fired its final shot, Jack dove forward, using the shield to block the blast, and with a mighty push, threw a sharp piece of metal straight into the drone's main power core. The drone exploded in a burst of sparks and metal shards. Alara stared in disbelief. She had been rescued by a human, a primitive human, whose actions spoke louder than any technology ever could. For the first time since her escape, Alara felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone. Maybe Earth wasn't as primitive as she had thought. And maybe, just maybe, this human could be the key to her survival. But as Jack pulled her to her feet and they moved deeper into the mountains, Alara knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The danger had just begun. The night was quiet in the cave, save for the occasional rustle of the wind outside. Inside, Alara sat against the cold stone, her mind racing. She had barely escaped death at the hands of the alien drones, and now she found herself hiding on a strange, primitive world with a human, a species she had always considered beneath her. Yet here she was, depending on him for survival. Jack had managed to protect her from the drones with nothing but his wits and a few crude tools. Alara had seen the intelligence in his actions, but she still couldn't shake the idea that humanity was no match for the highly advanced civilizations of the galaxy. She had to remind herself that Earth was supposed to be nothing more than a distant backwater, a place of no consequence. Jack sat across from her, his back against the rocky wall of the cave, his eyes fixed on the fire he'd built. He had been quiet for a while, but Alara could sense that he was thinking deeply. She couldn't help but wonder about this human. Who was he? What was he doing on this planet, so far removed from the galactic conflicts she knew? "Why are you helping me?" Alara asked, her voice breaking the silence. Jack didn't immediately answer. Instead, he leaned forward, poking the fire with a stick to keep the flames steady. The light flickered in the dark cave, casting shadows on the rough stone walls. "I don't know," Jack finally said, his voice rough but steady. "It just felt right. I've seen people in trouble before, and it never felt like I had a choice. Helping you, well, it just felt like the right thing to do." He glanced up at her, his eyes meeting hers. "What about you? Why did you leave? Who were they to you?" Alara hesitated, unsure of how much she should reveal. She had been raised in a world where diplomacy and secrecy were key, but here, in this hidden cave, with nothing but the two of them for company, she felt strangely compelled to share. She trusted him, perhaps more than she realized. "They were family," Alara said, her voice softer now. "My uncle, the Emperor, he betrayed me. I was supposed to inherit the throne, but he took it for himself. The coup, it was brutal. My guards were killed, and I barely managed to escape. My people, my empire, they might never see me again." She looked down at her hands, feeling the weight of her words. "I never thought it would end like this, alone, stranded on a primitive world." Jack listened intently, his expression somber. "That's rough," he said quietly. "But you know, I've heard stories about people like you, people who have everything, but still want more. And in the end, they'd lose it all." Alara frowned, confused by his words. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Jack continued, "that no matter how much power you have, it's not worth anything if you can't survive, if you can't stand on your own 2 feet. He leaned back against the stone wall, his gaze distant. "Out here on Earth, we don't have the luxury of relying on anyone else. We fight for every day, for every scrap of food, for every breath we take. No one's going to save you out here, not unless you save yourself first." Alara studied him for a moment. His words were harsh, but there was truth in them. She had never truly experienced life the way Jack had. On her homeworld, everything was provided for her. She was surrounded by luxury, advanced technology, and a multitude of servants. But here, in this harsh, unforgiving environment, Jack had survived through sheer grit. She could see it now, his resilience, his self-reliance. "You live like this every day?" she asked, her voice filled with awe. Jack nodded. "Yeah, but it's not so bad. I've learned how to make do. We all do." He paused, glancing at her. "I don't have your fancy tech or anything, but we make things work. We're resourceful. And sometimes that's all you really need." Alara felt a pang of guilt at his words. She had relied so heavily on the power of her empire, on the technology that her people had developed, never considering that perhaps survival didn't always depend on advanced weapons or machines. She was learning that now, the hard way. But their conversation was interrupted by a low hum in the air, something mechanical. Alara stiffened, her heart racing. She knew that sound. It was the unmistakable hum of an advanced cloaking device. A hunter was nearby. Her hand instinctively went to her blaster, but Jack stopped her, shaking his head. "No time for that. We'll have to fight smart. Stay close." Alara looked at him, unsure. The alien bounty hunter that had been sent to kill her was highly advanced, equipped with cloaking technology and weapons far beyond anything Jack could hope to match. But she had no choice but to trust him. For the first time, she understood why Jack had been able to survive for so long on Earth. He was a survivor, and she needed him now more than ever. As the hum grew louder, Jack motioned for Alara to follow him, and they both crouched low to the ground. He moved silently, his footsteps barely making a sound on the rocky floor. Alara followed his lead, staying close to him. The bounty hunter was using cloaking technology, but Jack had already devised a plan. They reached a narrow pass in the cave, where the walls were jagged and uneven. Jack quickly gathered some rocks, carefully placing them in strategic spots. He then motioned for Alara to take cover behind a boulder, just out of sight of the hunter. "Stay here," Jack whispered. "I'll draw it out." Before Alara could protest, Jack darted into the open, making as much noise as possible. The hunter, sensing an opportunity, emerged from its cloaking device, its weapons raised and ready. It wasn't prepared for Jack's sudden attack. Jack had learned how to set traps. Simple, effective traps. As the hunter stepped forward, it triggered the first of Jack's makeshift devices. A hidden wire snapped tight, pulling a heavy rock down onto the hunter's cloaked physician. The hunter stumbled, disoriented for a split second. Alara watched in disbelief. Jack had set the perfect ambush. But the hunter wasn't out yet. It immediately retaliated, firing its weapons in Jack's direction. The blasts missed, but the force of the energy rounds sent rocks flying everywhere, creating an explosion of dust and debris. Jack ducked behind a boulder, narrowly avoiding the attack. Alara, still hidden, could see the determination in his eyes. He wasn't giving up, no matter what. Then she saw something that made her heart race. Jack pulled out a small device from his belt. It was a crude, yet ingenious EMP device, something he had built from scavenged tech. With a swift motion, he activated the device, sending a pulse of energy through the air. The hunter's weapons flickered, then powered down. For a moment, there was silence. The hunter, now defenseless, stood frozen, its cloaking device failing. Jack didn't hesitate. With a quick, decisive move, he lunged forward, using a sharp piece of metal to disable the hunter's power core. The hunter collapsed to the ground, sparking and sputtering, before going completely still. Alara stood in stunned silence as Jack returned to her side, breathing heavily but smiling. "You okay?" he asked, wiping the sweat from his forehead. She nodded, still in disbelief. "How did you?" "It's all about using what you have," Jack said with a grin. "We might not have fancy tech, but we've got brains. And that's enough sometimes." For the first time since she'd crash-landed on Earth, Alara felt a deep sense of admiration for this human. He had protected her against impossible odds. She realized now that her initial assessment of humanity had been wrong. Earth may have been a primitive world, but the people here were strong. They had resilience in their bones. And in that moment, Alara made a decision. She wasn't just going to survive, she was going to fight back. With Jack by her side, maybe Earth wasn't so weak after all. As the days passed in the hidden cave, Alara and Jack had begun to understand each other in ways they hadn't expected. The intense situation they were in forced them to work together more closely than ever before. While Jack was teaching Alara about Earth's way of life, its emotions, its struggles, and its victories, she was showing him how to use her alien technology to protect themselves. Their worlds couldn't have been more different, yet the need to survive on this strange planet was what brought them closer. For Alara, the concept of human emotion was a mystery. On her homeworld, emotions were controlled, measured, almost irrelevant in a society that valued logic, efficiency, and technological advancement above all. But Jack, in his own quiet way, had opened her eyes to something new. He spoke of love, of trust, of sacrifice, the things that made humans fight not just for themselves, but for others. At first, Alara couldn't fully grasp what Jack meant when he spoke about the importance of protecting those you cared about, even at the cost of your own life. To her, it seemed illogical, even reckless. But as she saw Jack's unflinching determination, even in the face of the overwhelming odds they faced, she began to see the truth behind his words. One night, as they sat by the fire, Jack began to open up more about his past. He spoke of his family, of how he had lost them to a terrible tragedy, and how he had learned to survive on his own ever since. Alara listened quietly, her eyes never leaving him as he spoke, realizing just how much strength this human had inside of him. She had never considered that a single human could carry so much pain and still stand strong. "I didn't have much growing up," Jack said, staring into the flames. "But I learned something early on. You can't just take and take. You've got to give back too, even when it's hard." Alara nodded slowly, her thoughts drifting. She had always been the one who received. Everything she needed had been given to her, whether it was technology or power or knowledge. But now she was seeing the world through Jack's eyes, understanding the value of sacrifice, the importance of giving more than just what was expected. On my world, Alara said, her voice soft but steady, we're taught that emotions can be a weakness. Logic, knowledge, power, that is what matters. Jack looked at her, his gaze thoughtful. Maybe your world's not so different from Earth in that way. We got our fair share of problems too. But sometimes it's not about power. Sometimes it's about doing the right thing, even if it doesn't make sense. Their conversations became more frequent, and with each one, Alara felt herself changing. She wasn't just the princess of the Centauri Empire anymore. She was a person, someone who had learned what it meant to trust, to rely on another, and to be part of something bigger than herself. And in Jack, she found an unexpected ally, someone she could count on when everything else seemed uncertain. As their relationship grew stronger, so did their understanding of the danger they faced. Alara knew her uncle would stop at nothing to capture her, to kill her if necessary, to solidify his control over the Centauri Empire. She had been the rightful heir, and now she was the last threat to his rule. She had no illusions about what he was capable of, and neither did Jack. One day, as they were going over their plans to escape the bounty hunter's relentless pursuit, the sky above them suddenly lit up in a terrifying, otherworldly glow. Alara froze, her eyes wide with horror. She recognized the formation of ships in orbit. Her uncle's fleet had arrived. Jack, Alara whispered, barely able to speak. They're here. The fleet. My uncle. He's coming for me. Jack looked up, his jaw tightening. He had seen the look on Alara's face before, utter determination mixed with fear. But he didn't need to ask more questions. He knew the gravity of the situation. The fleet had arrived, and their world was about to be thrown into chaos. Alara stood up quickly, her mind racing. We need to act fast. My uncle has already begun the bombardment. We don't have much time. She began to fumble with a small device she had hidden in her pack. There's a satellite defense system on this planet. Outdated and primitive, but it might give us a chance. I can activate it, but it's not going to hold for long. We need to buy time. Jack nodded without hesitation. I'll help you. We've come this far. Let's finish this. Together, they quickly made their way to an old military base, hidden deep within the mountains. The place had been abandoned for years, but Alara knew exactly where to go. Her expertise with alien technology proved invaluable as she quickly accessed the old systems and began working her way through the security protocols. What's the plan? Jack asked, his eyes scanning the area, alert for any signs of danger. We need to activate the satellite defense system, Alara explained. Once it's up and running, it will create a temporary force field around Earth's atmosphere. It won't last long, but it will give us a brief window to act. Jack looked at her, impressed. You really think this will work? It has to, she replied, her fingers moving swiftly across the controls. We don't have a choice. The humming sound of the system activating filled the air, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to shake as the force field was generated. A brilliant energy shield began to form around Earth, just as the first barrage of alien weapons began to hit. The force field flickered as the weapons collided with it, but it held, at least for now. We've bought ourselves some time, Alara said, her voice filled with both relief and urgency. But we need to move fast. Jack gripped her arm, looking into her eyes. What's next? Alara hesitated for a moment, then made her decision. We have to take the fight to them. We need to disable their weapon systems. If we don't, they'll destroy Earth before the day is out. Jack looked at her, his face set in determination. All right, but how do we get to their command ship? Alara's lips curled into a small, confident smile. We infiltrate it. "Are you serious?" Jack said, raising an eyebrow. "We don't exactly have a fleet of warships to back us up." Alara nodded, her gaze never wavering. "We don't need a fleet. We have something better, ingenuity. We'll find a way in. We have no other choice." The urgency in Alara's voice was enough to convince Jack. Together, they began to prepare for their next move. They didn't know how they would get to the alien command ship or how they would disable its weapons, but one thing was clear: they were in this together, and they would fight until the very end. As they made their final preparations, the skies above Earth grew darker, and the first waves of the alien fleet began their descent toward the planet. It was the calm before the storm, and Alara knew that everything was about to change. They had only one chance to strike back, and they would need every ounce of courage, every bit of strength, and all the trust they had built between them to survive the battle ahead. But no matter what happened next, Alara knew one thing for certain: Jack was no longer just a primitive human to her. He was her ally, her partner, and together they would face the storm. Jack and Alara stood at the edge of a cliff, overlooking the massive alien command ship that hovered above the darkened landscape. The ship's imposing form glowed with the eerie light of advanced technology, casting long shadows across the ground. Alara's hands trembled slightly as she held a small, sleek device in her palm, a cloaking device. This was their only chance to infiltrate the ship undetected. "You ready for this?" Jack asked, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. Alara nodded. "We don't have a choice. We either succeed or Earth is lost." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Earth, the planet that Jack had spent his entire life on, was now the target of a highly advanced alien empire. Alara, an alien princess from the Xentari Empire, was the only hope to stop her uncle's forces. Together, they had defied the odds so far, but now they were about to face the ultimate test. Jack and Alara moved through the dense forest, using the cover of darkness to avoid detection. Jack's military training and guerrilla tactics were invaluable now, as he led the way, guiding Alara through the dense underbrush. Her alien technology gave them an edge in stealth, but it was Jack's quick thinking and survival instincts that kept them one step ahead of the enemy. As they approached the alien command ship, Jack's mind raced. This was unlike anything he had ever faced before. The ship's defenses were formidable, and the soldiers inside were far more advanced than anything humanity had ever encountered. But despite the overwhelming odds, Jack felt a fire in his gut, a desire to protect the planet he loved and the alien princess who had become an unexpected ally. They reached the underside of the ship, where Alara activated the cloaking device. Instantly, they became invisible to the naked eye. The device hummed softly as it created a protective field around them, masking their presence from the ship's sensors. With their movements carefully calculated, they slipped through the shadows, sneaking past guards and alien drones who patrolled the area. Inside the ship, the contrast between Jack's primitive methods and the alien technology was staggering. The walls of the ship shimmered with high-tech panels, holographic interfaces, and energy weapons that looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. Yet Jack wasn't intimidated. His mind was focused on the task at hand: disable the ship's defenses and give Earth a fighting chance. "This way," Alara whispered, guiding Jack down a narrow corridor. "The main control room is ahead. We can disable the ship's weapon systems there." They crept forward, careful not to make a sound. But as they approached the control room, their presence was detected. A warning siren blared, sending a shock of adrenaline through Jack's veins. "We've been made," he said, his voice low. Alara immediately sprang into action, pulling out a small device from her belt. "I can hack into their systems, but we need to move quickly. They'll send reinforcements." Jack nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure how much longer their cloaking device would last, but he knew they had to act fast. The alien soldiers were closing in. Suddenly, the door to the control room slid open with a loud hiss, revealing a group of heavily armed alien soldiers and drones. They were tall, armored beings, their sleek bodies glowing with the power of their technology. Their weapons hummed with deadly energy, and their eyes gleamed with an air of superiority. Jack didn't hesitate. He dove into action, using the environment to his advantage. He grabbed a nearby piece of metal debris and hurled it toward the soldiers, creating a diversion. As the soldiers turned to investigate the noise, Jack sprinted into the control room, closely followed by Alara. Inside the control room, Jack's quick thinking saved them. He spotted a row of exposed cables and instantly pulled out a small EMP device from his pack. "Alara, cover me," he shouted. Alara nodded, using her alien tech to create a temporary shield around them. As Jack worked frantically to wire the EMP device into the ship's systems, the alien soldiers regrouped outside, preparing for an assault. The tension in the room was thick, the sound of blasters charging outside making the seconds feel like hours. With a final twist, Jack activated the EMP. The ship shuddered, and the lights flickered as the EMP surged through the ship's systems, temporarily disabling the defense mechanisms. Jack exhaled sharply, relieved that it had worked. "We've got a window," he said, looking at Alara. "Let's move." But just as they were about to make their escape, the door burst open, and more alien soldiers stormed in. This time, they were ready. They charged forward, their weapons aimed at Jack and Alara. Without warning, Jack's close friend, Bonner, appeared from behind a wall, guns blazing. Bonner had been a part of Jack's team during the early days of their fight against the Centauri Empire. He had always been the first to dive into danger, always the one to watch Jack's back. "Get out of here," Bonner shouted, his voice full of urgency. "I'll hold them off." Jack's heart twisted as he saw Bonner take up position, his weapon firing at the advancing soldiers. But Bonner was outnumbered, and Jack knew they didn't have much time. "No," he shouted. "You can't." But it was too late. Bonner threw himself into the fray, taking down several alien soldiers before one of them landed a fatal blow. Jack watched in horror as Bonner fell, his body crumpling to the ground. Alara, too, was frozen, her eyes wide with shock. She had never seen a human fight so fiercely for another. She had always known of humans as being primitive, but she was seeing something in Jack and his friends that was beyond her comprehension. The willingness to sacrifice everything for a cause. Jack's grief hit him like a punch to the gut, but his rage and determination were stronger. "Bonner," he screamed, his voice raw with emotion. His friend had given his life so that they could complete their mission. Jack wasn't going to let his sacrifice be in vain. With renewed fury, Jack grabbed a fallen alien weapon and turned it on their enemies. Alara fought beside him, her alien tech helping them to take down the remaining soldiers and drones. Every move was calculated, every step driven by the need for revenge, for justice. As the last of the soldiers fell, Jack stood over them, his chest heaving with exertion. His eyes burned with a mixture of grief and fury. Bonner had died so that they could keep fighting, and Jack would honor that sacrifice. Alara placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, her voice soft but firm. "We have to keep going. We can't stop now." Jack nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "For Bonner," he whispered, "we finish this." Together, they moved forward, determined to disable the ship's weapons and give humanity a chance to fight back. They had lost a friend, but they had gained something far more important. A deeper bond, a reason to keep fighting. The mission wasn't over. Not yet, and they would see it through, no matter what it took. The alien command ship loomed before them, its defenses temporarily down. Jack and Alara weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for revenge, for their fallen comrades, and for the future of Earth. The odds were stacked against them, but together, they would face whatever came next. The dark expanse of space was alive with a chaotic dance of light and motion. Above Earth, a massive fleet of alien ships hovered, their metallic bodies reflecting the distant glow of the stars. In the center of it all, the flagship of the Centauri Empire, the Abyssal Tyrant, loomed large and ominous. It was a colossal warship, brimming with advanced technology and powerful weaponry. Its sleek surface shimmered with a cold, unfeeling light as it awaited its orders. Jack and Alara watched from the window of their makeshift hideout, their eyes fixed on the impending disaster. The arrival of the Centauri fleet was like a nightmare made real. They had managed to infiltrate the alien command ship and deal a significant blow to the Empire's forces. But this was different. This was Alara's uncle, the Emperor, bringing his full might to bear. His forces had already begun the process of orbital bombardment, sending destructive waves of energy raining down upon Earth. As Jack and Alara stood in the shadows of the cave, Alara's hand clenched into a fist. "My uncle, he's lost all humanity," she murmured, her voice filled with both anger and sorrow. She had once called this man family, but the actions he was taking now were unforgivable. The Centauri Emperor was no longer the man she had known. Jack placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We won't let him destroy your world," he said, his voice unwavering. "We still have a chance." The fate of Earth, and possibly the entire galaxy, now rested on their shoulders. The Emperor's fleet descended upon Earth in waves, led by the flagship. Drones and robotic soldiers filled the air, their bladed limbs and glimmering armor reflecting the sun's light. The battle had begun. Jack's thoughts raced. He knew what they had to do: get to the flagship, plant the explosives, and stop the orbital bombardment. But they would have to cross enemy lines, infiltrate the heart of the Emperor's fleet, and survive a battle unlike any they had ever faced. And with the Emperor's personal, eye-controlled fleet patrolling the skies, the task was nearly impossible. "We'll need a plan," Jack said, eyes narrowing as he surveyed the situation. "We can't just walk up to the flagship. The whole fleet will be on us before we get close." Alara nodded. "We have to use their arrogance against them. They think they've won already. We need to strike where they least expect it." With no time to waste, Jack and Alara made their way to the edge of the battlefield, the chaos of the fight raging above them. Ships darted through space, their engines roaring as they unleashed barrages of laser fire. The Centauri fleet was relentless, sending wave after wave of destruction toward Earth. The distant sounds of explosions echoed in their ears, the Earth's atmosphere shimmering with the fiery streaks of missiles and energy beams. The tension was unbearable. Jack felt a knot form in his stomach. They were up against an army of robotic soldiers, drones, and advanced warships, each more deadly than anything humanity had ever faced. But they had one advantage. The Emperor's fleet was so focused on the bombardment that they were leaving openings in their defenses. Jack and Alara had to exploit those gaps. Using the cover of the battle, they slipped past enemy lines, moving in a blur of motion. Their hearts raced with adrenaline as they ducked into the shadows of the wreckage left behind by the ongoing dogfight. Jack could hear the hiss of laser blasts overhead, each one narrowly missing their position. They were so close now, so close to the flagship. They could almost taste victory. The moment they reached the flagship, they slipped inside, evading patrols and bypassing security systems. Jack's pulse quickened as they made their way through the dark corridors of the ship. His thoughts kept turning back to Earth, to the people who were depending on him. There was no room for failure. They reached the control room, the heart of the warship, where the Emperor's fleet was being coordinated. There, Jack and Alara planted the explosives, wiring them into the ship's core systems. Their hands moved with practiced speed, their hearts beating in time with the countdown. They had one shot at this, one chance to stop the Emperor. Suddenly, a voice boomed from behind them. "You thought you could defeat me." Jack turned quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon, but it was too late. The Emperor himself had appeared, flanked by his robotic soldiers. His eyes glowed with the cold, calculating intelligence of a being who had long since abandoned any trace of empathy. "You dare challenge the might of the Centauri Empire?" The Emperor sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. You are nothing more than a human, a primitive, fragile creature who dares to defy me." Alara stepped forward, her eyes burning with defiance. "You've gone too far, Uncle. This madness ends now." The Emperor's gaze flickered toward her, a mix of surprise and anger flashing across his features. "Alara, you were always weak. You'll never understand the true power of the Centauri. You are nothing compared to what I have built." Jack's anger flared as he stood beside Alara. "The only thing you've built is destruction, and we're here to stop it." With a wave of his hand, the Emperor ordered his fleet to engage, sending waves of drones and soldiers toward Jack and Alara. The air was alive with the sound of combat, laser blasts, explosions, and the shrill screech of robotic soldiers charging at them. The battle had intensified, and now Jack and Alara were caught in the heart of it all. Laser fire exploded around them, and the ground shook with the force of the impacts. Jack ducked and weaved, firing his weapon at the advancing drones. Alara was by his side, using her advanced alien technology to disable the enemy forces. Together, they fought with everything they had, knowing that the fate of Earth hung in the balance. The countdown on the explosives was ticking down. Jack knew they didn't have much time. He turned to Alara, his eyes meeting hers. "We have to get out of here now." With no other choice, they fought their way through the enemies, dodging laser fire and scrambling to escape. But the Emperor's fleet wasn't about to let them go so easily. The eye-controlled ships engaged them in a final desperate attempt to stop them from completing their mission. As they neared the escape hatch, Jack took a deep breath. The tension in the air was palpable. His mind raced with thoughts of Earth, of the people he had left behind, of his promise to protect them. The countdown continued. 5 seconds, Alara called out. With a final push, they made it to the hatch. The explosion that followed was deafening. The flagship shook as the force of the blast ripped through its core, sending shockwaves through the entire fleet. The Emperor's flagship had been destroyed, and with it, the heart of the Centauri invasion force. But the battle was far from over. The remaining ships continued to fire upon each other, the fate of Earth still hanging by a thread. As Jack and Alara made their way back to Earth's surface, they knew one thing for certain: the fight wasn't finished. The Emperor had been defeated, but his forces were still out there, ready to strike again. But for now, Earth had won a brief reprieve, and Jack, alongside Alara, was prepared to fight until the very end to protect it. The air was thick with tension as Jack and Alara stood on the deck of the damaged flagship, the Emperor's looming figure at the far end of the room. The entire battlefield had shifted to this one moment, an inevitable showdown between humanity's raw, unyielding spirit and the cold, calculated force of the Centauri Empire. The Emperor, an advanced being who had fused his mind with the might of his eye-controlled fleet, was an embodiment of alien and technological superiority. His towering figure, draped in dark armor, was an intimidating sight. But it was not just his imposing form that made him terrifying. It was his mind, an eye-enhanced intellect that calculated every move, every possibility, without hesitation. "Do you really think you can stop me?" The Emperor's voice echoed, his tone dripping with arrogance and disdain. "You're nothing more than a primitive species, fighting with outdated weapons and emotions. I have transcended those limitations." Jack stood firm, his body tensed with determination. "You may have all the power, but you don't have what we have: heart. And that's something you can never compute." The Emperor scoffed, his cold, digital mind processing Jack's words with little concern. He had seen humans as weak, emotional creatures, easy to manipulate and destroy. But this human, Jack, had defied him at every turn. And now, at this moment, it was clear this would be a fight to the end. Alara, who had once been a part of the very empire Jack was fighting against, stood by his side. She had learned much from him, especially about the strength that lay in human resilience, adaptability, and trust. These were qualities the Centauri Empire had overlooked, deeming them insignificant. Now, they would be the very tools they needed to win. The Emperor's eye-powered fleet, still reeling from the explosions caused by Jack and Alara's sabotage, regrouped around the flagship, ready to strike. The remaining ships hovered like vultures, awaiting the signal to annihilate the last remnants of Earth's defense. The fate of humanity rested on this final battle. Jack knew that fighting the Emperor head-on would be impossible. He had to outsmart him, using his human ingenuity. He turned to Alara, his eyes burning with resolve. We need to hack into his AI systems. If we can take out the central control, the fleet will be rendered useless. Alara nodded, understanding exactly what Jack meant. She had spent years learning about alien technology, but this was something entirely different, something her people had never even considered. Humanity's unpredictability, their willingness to bend the rules, was their greatest asset. Together, they made their way to the heart of the flagship, where the Emperor's AI systems were housed. The ship was a maze of high-tech corridors and shimmering walls, all designed to intimidate and control. As they navigated through the labyrinth, Jack's mind raced. He had spent hours studying the ship's layout, and he had one goal: access the central AI core and turn it against the Emperor. The tension was almost unbearable as they reached the control room. Jack quickly set to work, using the knowledge he had gained from the technology they had stolen earlier. Alara stood watch, her alien tech at the ready, her eyes scanning for any sign of trouble. She had never seen Jack so focused, his movements quick and precise as he hacked into the system. "I've got it," Jack muttered under his breath, his fingers flying across the console. "I'm in. Now we need to disable the control systems before he realizes what we're doing." The AI system hummed to life, its virtual presence pressing down on Jack as it attempted to counter his intrusion. But Jack had something the AI didn't: intuition. He didn't need to follow the rules or rely on calculations. He understood how to bend the system, how to think beyond what the AI could predict. His mind was like a wild card, throwing off the calculations that the Emperor's AI had counted on. As the central system began to falter, a message from the Emperor flashed across the screen. "You cannot win," the digital voice of the Emperor echoed, his tone cold and emotionless. "The AI is in control. Your human tricks are no match for the power of the Centauri Empire." But Jack didn't flinch. He knew the truth now. Technology, no matter how advanced, was only as good as the mind behind it. The Emperor may have fused his mind with the AI, but he had lost touch with what truly made a species strong: their hearts, their souls, their will to fight for what they believed in. With a final stroke, Jack disabled the core system. The AI, once the Emperor's greatest strength, faltered and went silent. The lights in the control room flickered as the ship's systems began to collapse under the weight of the attack. Outside, the fleet followed suit, the Centauri warships losing their coordination, their weapons malfunctioning. It was over. The Emperor's fleet, the deadly force that had once seemed invincible, was no more. The Emperor, now isolated and vulnerable, turned toward them, his eyes narrowing with fury. "You may have disabled my AI, but you will never defeat me. I am the Emperor. I am the future." Jack stepped forward, his voice steady. "No, you were the past." Alara stood beside him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "This empire has caused enough pain. It's time for it to end." With a final, decisive blow, Jack and Alara took down the Emperor's life support systems, rendering him helpless. His empire, once a symbol of invincibility, crumbled in an instant. The threat to Earth, to humanity, was no more. As the flagship exploded in a brilliant flash of light, signaling the death of the Emperor and his empire, Jack and Alara made their way back to Earth. They had won, but the battle had taken its toll. The victory wasn't just about defeating the enemy. It was about proving something much deeper: the resilience of the human spirit, the power of unity, and the unwavering belief in what was right. The remnants of the Centauri fleet scattered, unable to regroup without their emperor's leadership. Earth had been saved, and Jack had shown that even against the most technologically advanced forces, humanity could stand strong. As Jack and Alara looked out over the Earth's horizon, the sun rising above the ruins of war, they shared a quiet moment. It was a moment filled with relief, yes, but also with hope. The battle had been fierce, and the road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging. But for now, humanity had proven its strength. Alara, now fully trusting in humanity's resilience and heart, turned to Jack. Earth is not just a planet. It's a symbol. You've shown me that. Jack smiled, his eyes meeting hers. We've shown the galaxy what humanity is made of. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The alliance between Earth and the galaxy had begun. Together, they would rebuild, stronger than ever before. And for Jack and Alara, the promise of more adventures and challenges ahead brought a renewed sense of purpose. Their story, the story of humanity's victory, had only just begun.